Okay, welcome to the second of the two Tanner lectures by Professor Alan Gibbard of the University of Michigan. The title of his lecture today is Living Together, Economic and Moral Argument. Professor Gibbard.
I appreciate the brave people who returned. So the title has been announced, and we're beings who think about how to live. We each live with others, and we think how to live with each other. Sometimes a person will think about such things by herself, and sometimes we think and discuss together. Well, these are truisms, but I argued in the first lecture that the truisms are rich in consequences. They explain, if I'm right, the philosophically puzzling area of thought we call normative, thought that somehow involves oughts. I guess we're not ready for this yet. I want today to ask whether such a self-understanding could have any bearing on questions of right and wrong, of good and bad. Yesterday, I talked about moral concepts without using them. I did metaethics, not normative ethics, not the work of thinking what is right and what is wrong, and why. My metaethics leaves room for any coherent answer, whatever, to normative questions of what's right and what's wrong to do, and a wide range of possible answers are coherent. But I want to explore whether the metaethical picture I sketched contributes at all to making some answers to normative questions more plausible than others. In doing so, I'll have to pass lightly over controversies familiar in the literature, giving quick and insufficient arguments on issues that have been extensively and subtly debated. So I'll talk about a social contract and the strains of commitment. My late colleague, William Frankena, said, morality is made for man and not man for morality. And his saying is widely quoted. He told me that he regretted ever saying this, but I don't see that he had anything to regret. If morality should matter to us, if we should adhere to moral demands, even at great sacrifice, then morality shouldn't be arbitrary. Concern for morality should be out of concern for something that makes morality of value. And how could that be other than being of value for people? I don't mean to rule out other sentient beings, but in this lecture I'll stick to people. Most philosophers, I think, will agree with Frankena's saying, but we fall into contention when it comes to drawing out the implications. Moral inquiry in philosophy often comes in either of two broad styles. One is pragmatic, thinking what's in morality for us human beings, and asking what version of morality best serves us. The other broad style is intuitionist in one important sense of that term. Consult our moral intuitions, revise them as need be to achieve consistency, and embrace what emerges. The point isn't that these two styles of moral inquiry need entirely be at odds with each other. Henry Sidgwick, over a century ago, advocated a morality made for humanity and insisted that there could be no moral knowledge without intuition. And I end up agreeing with Sidgwick on this. Still, the two approaches are initially quite different in spirit. If morality is for humanity, then we might expect utilitarianism to be right. Moral rules, we might expect, will tell us to act for the benefit of humanity. The right act will be the one with the greatest total benefit to people. Utilitarianism, though, notoriously conflicts with strong moral intuitions. As a simple example, I'll start with the case from yesterday of children drowning. I'll then broach a line of argument that appeals to other intuitions and seems to lead back to a utilitarian answer. The case illustrates a much broader systematic argument for utilitarianism, one that draws on decision theory and was most notably advanced by Berkeley's own John Harsanyi well before he came to Berkeley. Aspects of the argument have been widely debated, and my aim is to use the debate to explore how moral inquiry might proceed if it consists in doing the sort of thing I claim in thinking how to live together. The case is due to Diane Jeske and Richard Fumerton, so two canoes of children capsize in rapids, and a man on the bank can rescue some but not all of the children. So close to him are two children, and he could rescue both. Further away is his own daughter, and alternatively, he could rescue her, but not the other two. Utilitarianism seems to say that faced with this grim choice, he should rescue two children rather than his own. Many people have the strong intuition that the father is morally permitted, perhaps even required by the duties of parenthood, to rescue his daughter, even though he must then let two children drown instead of one. This example is contrived in the style of many philosophical examples. The hope is, though, that such examples can let us examine considerations in isolation that get too complex to handle clearly in the kinds of morally fraught situations we're apt to encounter. I'll now introduce the style of argument I'll be exploring. Imagine now that the situation is a little more complex. There are two fathers on the two riverbanks by the rapids, and two canoes are swamped, each with two children. For each father, his own children are in the further canoe. Each could save either the two children closest to him or one but not both of his own children in the far canoe. The rule to give preference to one's own children, if each father follows it, means that each father loses a child. The rule to save as many children as possible, regardless of whose they are, means, if each father follows it, that no father loses a child. Perhaps in this freak circumstance, the fathers could quickly reach an agreement that each would rescue the other's children. They would then each have a contractual obligation to act as utilitarianism would command. And for this case, the contrast between intuition and utilitarianism might disappear. In its prescriptions for this particular case, a social contract would thus coincide with utilitarianism. Let's return, though, to the first story with one father whose child was in the far swamped canoe. So suppose that in advance the two fathers contemplate this contingency. One of them will be on the shore with one of his two children in the swamped in the far canoe. And the other's two children in the near canoe. So he could rescue both, alternatively, but one of his own children is in the far canoe, and he can rescue her, but if he rescues her, he can rescue nobody else. And we'll suppose that they have equal probabilities of being in either position, and whatever agreement is made will be kept. So what sorts of contracts might they come to cover this eventuality? Well, one contract would be the loyal one, we might say. I'll call it L, to save one's own child. Each save one's own child, one of the two children, because that's the most each father could save, or the father could save of his own children. Or we could have the maximizing contract to save the most children possible. So the upshots are shown on the right. In the case of the contract for loyalty to one's children, in case you're the lucky father on the shore, you don't lose any children. In case you're the unlucky father who isn't there, both your children are lost. So in the case of the maximizing contract, if you're this time the lucky father is the one who isn't there and then doesn't lose any children, but the unlucky one is the one who is there and contractually bound to rescue the other's children and then loses one child of his own. So in the lucky case, one doesn't lose any children. In the unlucky case, the unlucky father loses two children if the contract is to be loyal to one's children, and loses only one child if the contract is to rescue as many children as possible. So utilitarianism and contractarianism, in this case, give the same answer. Save the most possible. So in short, so long as whatever agreement they reach will be kept, then the first agreement in the unlucky case means losing both one's children, whereas the second in the unlucky case means losing only one child. Each is a terrible loss, but losing both children is even worse than losing one. And the two cases are equally likely, we've supposed. For each father, then, the second agreement, the maximizing the number saved, offers better prospects. Again, then, for the case in question, the two approaches give the same answer. Utilitarianism says to rescue as many children as one can, and so does the social contract that people would make if they knew that the social contract would be kept. Well, this kind of argument generalizes. John Harsanyi in the 1950s proved two famous theorems that apply, theorems which I think should be more famous than they are among students of moral philosophy. The import and the limitations of his theorems have been widely debated, and I'll be exploring how some aspects of the discussion might go if moral inquiry is the sort of thing that I think it is, planning how to live together. First, though, let's explore further the case of the children and the swamped canoes. The two fathers have agreed what to do in the contingency, and now one of them finds himself in the dilemma on the riverbank. He has agreed to save the two children that aren't his, but still, of course, he's strongly moved to save his own child. What motive might he have to keep the agreement and let his own child drown? His motive might be one of fair reciprocity. He would have done the same thing for my two children if our positions had been reversed, he could say to himself. Still, he faces the question of whether to reciprocate. Possibly fair reciprocity will insufficiently motivate him, and he'll fail to reciprocate in his desperate situation what the other father would have done for him and his children. A further question arises too, then. Would the other father have been sufficiently motivated? If the other would have reneged had their positions been reversed, then the father on the bank loses his rationale from fair reciprocity. Here, then, the upshot of contractarian thinking deviates from that of utilitarian thinking. Suppose for now that I'm right, that if the two could make an agreement with full assurance that the agreement would be kept, they would agree on the arrangement that utilitarianism prescribes. In this way, utilitarianism can stem not only from motives of benevolence, but from motives of fair reciprocity. That's only, though, if the motivations of fair reciprocity are never overwhelmed by other motives, and the parties have full assurance of this. A contractarian that heeds the limits of motives of fair reciprocity will be quite different. What would we have agreed on under the constraint that the motivations we would have to keep the agreement would be sufficiently strong if everybody knew that the agreement would be kept? All that will depend on a psychological question. How strong are the motives of fair reciprocity? How strong can we trust them to be under various relevant conditions? We can see now why there might be a contractarian excuse for rescuing one's own child in preference to two others. If we'd been able to make any agreement whatsoever and make it effective, we would have agreed to rescue as many children as possible, no matter whose. But we can't produce such strong motives, and under the constraints of how strong motives of fair reciprocity can be, we wouldn't have made such an agreement only to expect it not to be kept. Well, I'm touching on what John Rawls called the strains of commitment. In most of the rest of this lecture, I'll ignore them and explore other questions. I'll consider contractarian arguments that assume full assurance of full compliance, severe though this limitation is. Any full exploration of contractarian arguments, utilitarianism, and moral intuitions, though, would have to pay great heed to the strains of commitment. I'll now talk about the separateness of persons. One way of arriving at utilitarianism is to say that morality consists of benevolence, of impartial concern for all involved, including oneself. Rawls responded that impartial benevolence is a weak motive and that a far stronger motive is fair reciprocity. Tim Scanlon puts the motive differently, roughly as a concern to live with others on a basis that no one could reasonably reject. The Canoe case suggested a way in which all these might coincide, at least for the case of full compliance. Fair reciprocity consists in abiding by a practice if it's the practice we would have agreed to before we knew who would be in what position. To such a practice, no one could reasonably object. The question we ask in moral inquiry, I've been saying, isn't the psychological one of what motives we do have and how strongly, but the question of what motives to have. It's a planning question, a question of how to live with each other. Nothing in metaethics that I've laid out dictates an answer. Still, the ideals of fair reciprocity and of living with others on a basis they could not reasonably reject seem good candidates for what to want in one's dealings with others. These aims are vague, but I propose to think together with people who might be brought to share these aims and try to work toward specifications worthy of pursuit. Morality, it's often said, is grounded in respect for persons, and utilitarianism fails in that it can prescribe actions that violate people's rights and fail to respect them. I can't, of course, go over the history of systematic attempts to ground morality in respect and get non-utilitarian conclusions, but my own reading of this history is that these attempts have not had any great success, and our brief discussion of the canoe case illustrates why coherent non-utilitarian theories are so elusive. The vague aims of fair reciprocity and of dealing with others in a way that no one could reasonably reject do seem good places to start in working out what aims to have, what aims in the vicinity of aims that having respect might consist in having. What we would have agreed on seems highly relevant to what respect demands. Before I scrutinize confectarian arguments further, though, I'll say a few things about why I don't think respect leads us straightforwardly in directions that oppose utilitarianism. Well, Rawls charged that utilitarianism ignores the separateness of persons. A person is not to be sacrificed for the sake of another. One person's gain doesn't compensate for another's loss. Well, thinking in terms of gains and losses or sacrifice, though, requires a base point for comparison, and so we'll need some rationale for heeding one possible base point as opposed to others. So suppose we have persons, Ida and J, in states A and B, with Ida better off in state A and J better off in state B. And let's give numbers to how well off they are, as I've got up here. Okay, so Ida's gain in going from state B to state A, we might say, doesn't compensate for J's loss. Ida goes from 5 to 9, an improvement, but J goes from 3 to 1, a loss. J has only one life to lead, and we can't sacrifice him for Ida's benefit. But if we frame matters differently, we get the opposite conclusion. In going from state A to state B, Ida loses, going from 9 to 5. J gains, to be sure, but he and Ida, we can say, are separate persons, and Ida can't be sacrificed for J. To choose between the two seeming upshots of the separateness of persons, we must choose between state A and state B as a base from which gains and losses are measured and sacrifice is attributed. Rawls seems to choose the state with the worst off person, state A in this case. And others objected that we can't sacrifice the well-off to benefit the badly off. Nozick and some others who appeal to Kant say that we choose as the base state for comparison the state in which people are entitled to what they would have. And Rawls replied that when the basic structure of society is at issue, we're asking what entitlements to institute. Intuitions that invoke ownership and other entitlements are very strong, and they may well be wired into the human psychic makeup. They're very sensitive, though, to framing effects. Even a person's self-regarding choices are affected by attributing ownership. So consider endowment effects. We give a person a coffee mug and ask him if he'll trade it for a chocolate bar, and he says no. It seems he prefers having a mug to having the chocolate bar. But if we'd given him the chocolate bar instead, he would have refused to trade it for the mug. It seems he would then prefer having the mug to having the chocolate bar. It seems he would prefer having the chocolate bar to having the mug. The only difference is which of the two objects he frames as already his. Well, can we find some basis for attributing entitlements then that's independent of a pragmatic test, independent of evaluating the consequences of a system of entitlements by a standard that doesn't assume the importance of the entitlements in advance? Well, Nozick tried, but he left the basis of what he was saying unexplained and seemed to appeal to the pragmatic advantages of systems of property. Well, I conclude that we can't talk of gains and losses and sacrifice until we identify some base point for the comparisons. It's true enough that we're separate persons, but nothing about what we may permissibly do follows from that by itself. Our strong intuitions do latch on to some base point or other, but not in any consistent way. Perhaps we could establish some base point as morally relevant. One way to do so, though, would be to be the way I'll be exploring. Ask what we would have agreed to from behind a veil of ignorance, what we would have agreed to treat as morally relevant. So I'll talk about Harsanyi's theorems. Well, the point of morality, I'm taking it, is to live with each other on a basis that none of us could reasonably reject. No one has a reasonable objection if the system we live by is what we would have agreed to in fair conditions. And one way to make conditions fair is a veil of ignorance. We saw in the canoe case that this may yield utilitarian prescriptions. Harsanyi argued that this upshot generalizes. His argument starts with the coherence of plans for action. Decision theorists have shown that if a way of ranking actions satisfies certain conditions, then it's as if the person chose by maximizing an expected value. It's as if the person formed degrees of credence in the relevant eventualities, attributed levels of value to the various possible outcomes, and then took the alternative that held out the greatest expectation of value, reckoned with those degrees of credence and levels of value. Whether the axioms needed for this are really compelling has been a matter of great contention, but the argument for the standard conditions, as I'll call them, goes much like the argument I gave yesterday for Zackhauser's Russian roulette example. Peter Hammond systematizes such an argument, though his proof, I'm afraid, is couched in a fearsome mathematical apparatus. By the standard conditions, I'll mean any of various sets of conditions that have been shown to yield the result. And coherent plans, I'll assume, are plans that satisfy these conditions. It's highly contentious whether this is so, as I indicated yesterday, but I'll be exploring what we should think if it is so. So Harsanyi proved two theorems. The first conveyed something like Rawls's original position, where behind a veil of ignorance, no one knows what position he'll occupy in society. Think of valid moral rules as the rules one would choose, assuming an equal chance of being anyone. Assume one's preferences are coherent in that they satisfy the standard conditions. Then, Harsanyi proved, one will prefer the rules that would yield the greatest total utility. Here, by individual utility, I mean the scale that represents one's preferences, given that one will turn out to be that person. Well, the second theorem is this. Suppose that prospective individual benefit is coherent, and so is desirability from the moral point of view. Suppose also that morality is for humanity, at least in the following sense. If one prospect is better than a second for each individual, it's the better prospect ethically. This is called the prospective Pareto condition. Then the desirability from a moral point of view, he proved, is a weighted sum of individual benefit. the only way ethical evaluation could satisfy these conditions and depart from utilitarianism is by weighing one person's benefit more than another's. Economists represent the theorem in graphical form, so we have a set here of all the possible combinations of Ida's benefit and J's benefit, Ida's shown horizontally, J's shown vertically, that are achievable by social policy. And think of these as prospects that are achievable. Well, suppose this is the, presumably they agree on some point on this frontier. They agree on some point where you couldn't make both of them better off at once. If they agreed here, you could improve things for both of them. So why would they agree on this rather than this? Okay, suppose the point is this one, then the argument is just, well, that's taking things as far as they can go in a certain direction, and that amounts to say that one's maximizing some weighted sum of the benefit of one and the benefit of the other. Okay. So the challenge to anyone who wants to get a non-utilitarian morality out of thought on a social contract is how to evade the force of Harsanyi's two theorems. If you're going to be a non-utilitarian, you will adopt moral rules that none of us would have chosen for his own sake unless he knew of some special way that he and not others stood to benefit. And any evaluation of the prospects that various different moral orders bring must either violate some demand of rationality, or weigh one person's utility above another's, or rank some prospect best, even though another prospectively benefits everyone more. Now, Harsanyi's theorem has been much discussed, if not sufficiently. The quick, careless statements of the theorems that I have given would require close scrutiny, and important parts of the needed scrutiny are in print. John Broome is possibly the world's leading expert on the ethical aspects of this. What I can hope to do is just to select a few issues that are relevant to these debates, framing the theorems as parts of moral inquiry as I've been picturing it. So back to talking about a person's good. What is a person's good or benefit? In the tradition that Harsanyi worked in, a person's good is a matter of her preferences. We gauge the strength of her preferences by the preferences she would have among gambles. If you would risk a 1 in a million chance of being killed by a car, but no more, to cross the street to buy a chocolate bar, then the benefit to you of a chocolate bar counts as 1/1,000,000th of the harm to you of being killed. This notion of benefit has at least three chief problems. One seems tractable enough. Philosophers hasten to add that the preferences must be considered and informed. A second is more difficult. The preferences of any decent person won't just be for that person's own benefit. The person will care about others. He will care about fairness. He'll care perhaps about living with others on a basis that no one could reasonably reject. A person's benefit is at best one component of his considered informed preferences. So what component is that? Well, the third problem interacts with the second. What people prefer for themselves differs from person to person. Some differences aren't fundamental. I dislike asparagus, and my wife Beth loves it, so I prefer not to eat it, and Beth prefers to eat it. Basically, though, we both want to enjoy our food, and we're different in what we enjoy. Other examples, though, might be different. When I taught school in Ghana, people told me that one thing they lived for was a big funeral. Well, that puzzled me, but as I thought about it, I realized that a big funeral indicates how one is loved and respected in the community, and to be loved, respected, and missed did seem to be things a person could intelligibly put great stock in. Still, once we distinguish carefully what goes on in one's life and what happens after, people may differ in whether they care for their own sakes, how they're regarded after death. When I stand behind a veil of ignorance and choose a social ethos to institute, I contemplate that I may turn out to be you with your basic preferences, and I may turn out to be me with my basic preferences. You and I may differ even in the basic preferences we would have if our preferences were fully considered and informed. Rawls stressed this and proposed instead of looking to self-regarding preferences, that we look to what he called an index of primary social goods. Primary goods he defined as things one wants, whatever else one wants. Saying all this, however, leaves it as part of his project to find some basis for this index. Rawls thought the problem was mitigated by his theory, since he only had to deal in broad categories like income and opportunities, and only had to identify whether the worst off were better off under one arrangement than under another, since he was trying to make the worst off best off. In fact, though, his theory ends up placing great demands on this index. What turns out to matter in his theory, at least as I read it among various things he says, is the life prospects of those in the worst starting positions in life. Well, to tote up uncertain prospects, we need more than an ordering from best outcomes to worst. We need to know what differences are big and what differences are small. We need what measurement theorists call a cardinal scale, and we need to be able to compare people on that scale. I'm asking about the basis we might have for these comparisons. As for Scanlon, he never engages directly the kind of perspective argument that lies at the center of Rawls's original position and Harsanyi's theorems, as far as I know. I've followed Harsanyi and Rawls in saying how we can dismiss some objections as unreasonable. So you do something and I object. You reply, that's the established way we do things, and that's what you would have wanted before you knew which of us you would be and how in particular it would affect you. This seems to show my objection unreasonable, and from crediting such dismissals, Harsanyi draws powerful consequences, or as I'm putting Harsanyi's theorems. We now see, though, that he must place great demands on the notion of individual benefit. Scanlon offers an extended critique of the notion of welfare or a person's good, and this, I take it, constitutes his response to Harsanyi. His critique doesn't rule out the possibility of dismissing objections as unreasonable on prospective grounds in the kind of way I've been discussing. It does, though, place an advocate of such tests, place on an advocate of such tests the burden of saying what notion of benefit could play this role. Scanlon allows that a notion of a person's good can be tailored to play a role in moral theory. Clearly, though, from the way he himself develops his test, he doesn't think the test of what we would have wanted from behind a veil of ignorance plays anything like the broad and systematic role in a coherent moral theory that Harsanyi thought it played. Scanlon's critique of the concept of a person's good is a serious one, and I'll be particularly concerned to respond to it. I'll be arguing that we can't derive the needed notion of individual benefit directly from the preferences that people have, or even the preferences they would have in ideal conditions. Instead, forming a conception of benefit, of the intrinsic reward of a life, as I sometimes have called it, is part of ethical thinking, part of thinking how to live among other people. That fits a pattern of what Scanlon himself concludes, but if the retort I've imagined always deflates a claim that an objection is reasonable, then thought of prospective benefit will have a much larger role in coherent ethical thinking than Scanlon gives it. So I'll talk about preferences for being another. To illustrate and explore the problem, let's return to the simple toy case of Ida and J. I'll suppose first that we understand the notion of a person's good. So suppose again that how well off Ida and J would be in states A and B go as follows. And this is the same diagram as before. So in structure A, Ida would have 9 and J would have 1. In structure B, Ida would have 5 and J would have 3. We can also give the expected value of having equal chances of being Ida and J, 5 in the case of an equal chance of being of 9 and 1, and 4 in the case of an equal chance of 5 and 3. These numbers are chosen so that the index of a prospect is just how prospectively well off someone is who has those outcomes. Okay, well, Harsanyi's argument favors structure A. Before they both knew who they would be, both would prefer structure A with expected level 5 to structure B with expected level 4. J comes out badly under structure A, but A is the going structure, and he has no reasonable objection to it. Well, I turn now to the objection raised by Gautier, Suzumura, and others. What do the numbers in my simple table represent? They represent evaluations from behind a veil of ignorance of people who are choosing basic social structure only for their own prospective benefit. We're asking what notion of benefit feeds into the moral force of the rejoinder. That's the structure you would have chosen. Well, Ida, from behind the veil of ignorance, contemplates two possibilities, that she will be Ida and that she will be J. Now, Ida in the world, let's suppose, wants a big funeral, and in state A she gets it, whereas in state B she doesn't. Does she have this preference behind the veil of ignorance? Well, suppose she does, but J doesn't. So J understands that in case he turns out to be Ida, his actual concerns very much include having a big funeral, but being J, he doesn't intrinsically care about having a big funeral. He's indifferent between being Ida and having a big funeral, and being Ida and unexpectedly being buried after death without ceremony. Being Ida, he understands, includes wanting a big funeral, but as he is behind the veil, he's indifferent between wanting a big funeral and getting it, and wanting a big funeral and not getting it. If I get it, he figures, I won't be around to enjoy it, and if I don't, I'll never miss it. Well, once we distinguish Ida's preference for being Ida in A from J's preference for being Ida in A, we get a more complex table like the one up here. So we have to distinguish Ida's preferences for being in state A or state B, and in one case being Ida, being J, from J's preferences for, say, being, well, in particular here, Ida's preferences for being Ida in state A with a big funeral. She wants that a lot. And J's preferences for being Ida in A with a big funeral, which J is indifferent to, even for the case where he turns out to be Ida. So Ida's evaluation of being Ida under structure A includes 4 units for having a big funeral and 5 for other aspects of how things go for her. And J's evaluation of being Ida under structure A includes only the 5 units. From behind the veil, he places no value on actually having the funeral. Well, Ida now can't refute J's objection by saying that A is the state he would have chosen if he hadn't known who he would be. He would have chosen state B, which gives him an expected utility of 4 as, 5 that should be, and as opposed to 3. Suppose, though, the structure B has been instituted, and Ida, not getting a big funeral, objects. Or, since she's not around to object, suppose someone objects on her behalf. Well, J can't deflate the objection by saying that B is the structure she would have chosen if she hadn't known who she would turn out to be. So for each state, there's an objection that can't be shown unreasonable, at least in this way. Unless we could find some other way to show one of the objections unreasonable, we're damned whichever state we institute. Well, that fits in with Scanlon's critique. There's no one coherent notion, he says, that will do the jobs that welfare or a person's good has been asked to do in much ethical thinking, roughly first determining first what a person will choose insofar as others aren't affected, what others concerned to benefit him will choose to promote, and what counts as the person's good for purposes of moral thinking. We're asking about the third, what counts as a person's good for the purposes of moral thinking, and indeed, as Scanlon told us, not finding a way to read off a person's good from her preferences. An appealing way out would be to let Ida be the judge of her own good. The problem remains, though, as Rawls insisted, from behind the veil of ignorance in his system, we're choosing among alternative basic structures of society. What people will want at base might be highly affected by the kind of society we choose to have been nurtured in. Ida might have been indifferent to a big funeral if she'd grown up in a different sort of society, in an alternative social order that is open to choice from behind the veil of ignorance. Well, Rawls, as I say, was responding partly to this kind of problem when he set up his index of primary social goods, but I claim offered no adequate defensible rationale for its solution. So I'll be asking whether such a rationale can be provided. So back to the question of a person's good. Let's call the retort I've been discussing the "you'd have agreed" retort. It does seem to have moral force, and we're left with the question of what kind of force to accord it. Objections to a social order often are on the grounds that it unfairly disadvantages someone. Such an objection itself appeals to a notion of advantage or benefit, and so if the retort is incoherent because it requires a notion of a person's good, then so was the original objection. Let me get back then to the more basic perspective with which I started. We need to think what to prefer in our dealings with others and why. When I think why to prefer something, there's a challenge I can put to myself. If I find myself drawn to a preference, I can ask, for whose sake? Franken is saying, morality is made for man and not man for morality, tells us to be suspicious of preferences for which we can't find this answer, for which we can't answer this question. How, we've been asking, does this bear on thinking how to live with others? How does it bear if an ideal of fair reciprocity is one to pursue, as what living with others fairly on a basis they could not reasonably reject consists in? In thinking how to live with others, I start with incoherent impulses and preferences. An ideal answer to how to live would be formally coherent, among other things, and that requires working my raw, incoherent preferences into something more coherent. There are, though, many formally coherent plans for how to live, most of them with little to recommend them. If, though, the ideals that I've been exploring are ones to develop and make coherent, then our answers to how to live should take a form we might call humanistic, to live for the sake of people, oneself very much included. That, of course, leaves the question of whether alternative coherent plans for living might equally deserve the name humanistic, but for now I'll appropriate the name and try to work out this ideal. What is it to put one's preferences in a form that is not only formally coherent, but humanistic too? Humanistic preferences, vaguely, are preferences for the sake of people. One way you might try interpreting this is by a number of loose axioms. So first, the axiom will be, prefer most to live with others on a basis that no one could reasonably reject on one's own behalf. So this is an imperative that I direct to myself. Prefer most to live with others on a basis that no one could reasonably reject on her own behalf. This is a plan, or a fragment of a plan, but with crucial terms left unexplained. We must specify what it is to reject a basis for living with each other reasonably and on one's own behalf, and hence the next axiom. A rejection of a social arrangement on one's own behalf is unreasonable if, absent information about which person one would turn out to be, one would have chosen that arrangement for one's own sake. Okay. So this leaves to be explained, choosing a thing for one's own sake. So we could try saying, one chooses what one most prefers, that is one, and so in particular, one chooses for one's own sake what one most prefers for one's own sake, and moreover, for the case of being person J in social arrangement X, what one prefers for one's own sake is what is to J's good in X. So this leaves another uninterpreted term, the term good in the phrase person J's good in state X. So what then constitutes a person's good? We're still left with that question. Now, though, we could say that a person's good is whatever plays the role of a person's good in this string of four conditions. The question of what constitutes a person's good is part of the question of what to prefer in life. The string of four conditions is a formal constraint on how to live with others. The constraint is to live with others on some specification or other of the ideal of fair reciprocity, which specification is a further planning question, a further question of how to live with others. If our preferences for how to live, as we struggle to make them coherent, do take this form, then we can go on to argue in Harshanyi's way that behind the veil of ignorance, one would choose the social arrangement that, in prospect, maximizes the sum of people's goods. Preferring to live on that basis, one prefers to do one's part in a utilitarian order, provided that everyone else can be fully expected to do so. None of this settles whether to have preferences that take humanistic form, and so nothing Harshanyi showed demonstrates that the right answer to how to live includes this dictum to reciprocate in utilitarian arrangements. Other ways of living are coherent, and one of those might be the way to live with others, for all Harshanyi and I have shown. I hope, though, that I've given some glimmering of what speaks for such preferences as a way of filling out the wish to live with each other on a basis that no one could reasonably reject. And Harshanyi did show that any alternative to preferences for living that give some valuation to the role of a person's good must have a disturbing feature. Either the preferences that constitute adhering to that alternative are formally incoherent, or for every possible way of specifying a person's good, they include preferences for a societal structure that's prospectively worse for everyone. I come to a view of what a person's good is, then, if and when I come to have preferences that take this humanistic form. We come to a joint view and discussion of what a person's good is if we all come to have preferences that take this form, and for each of us the same valuations play the role in these, the same valuations play the role that these conditions assign to a person's good. A few comments on this approach. Comments on where this leaves things, and then I'll raise some questions that we can discuss further tomorrow. First, if fair reciprocity takes a utilitarian form in the way I've pictured, that only answers a sharply delimited moral question, namely what to do with full compliance for the scheme we would have wanted. It doesn't say anything about what to do if others can't be expected fully to comply with such a kingdom of ends. Second, the preference to live on a basis of mutual respect may not be overriding. In coming to a view on how to live, I might find the contractual ideal strongly appealing, but still plan to opt out in extreme circumstances. What contracts we might make if we know I'm bound to be like this, I haven't explored. Third, I'm distinguishing a person's good from her preferences, and surely I'm right to do so, but still there must be some close tie between the two. Unless I find that people normally do care deeply about their own good, something's gone wrong with the conception of a person's good that I've constructed. That a person will care about her own good, though, is not something that stems from the sheer logic of the concept of a person's good. The question of what's to a person's good, I've been saying, boils down to a planning question. It's a question of what, if anything, to respond to as a matter of fair reciprocity, of what to treat as fair conditions for having decided the basic ethos to govern us, and supposing that if the going system is one we would have chosen in those conditions, then its rules are the ones to follow and to feel as just. Being the way we are, the things we'll accord this status will be things that we do find important. Often, indeed, the more we know about what it's like to be a person, the more we'll find that the things that the person feels important indeed are important. We'll find that there are things to want for the case of being that person, and things to want to have weight in deciding social arrangements. Still, I've insisted that the two can come apart. I can conclude that something I put great stock in isn't really at base a thing to want. I can find myself caring about whether my parents would have approved of what I'm doing, and yet conclude that doing what they would have approved of is not something to want for its own sake. I can have the same thoughts about something another person puts great stock in. If I may be mistaken, others may be too. Well, suppose, though, what a person wants isn't for that person's own good, or for anyone else's for that matter. Still, doesn't respect for a person mean giving the person scope to pursue the goals that the person adopts? Isn't respect then basically different from heeding a person's good? There are weighty reasons to allow people scope to pursue their freely chosen ends. They're far more likely to be sensitive to what's to their own good than anyone else is, and the social structure that most realizes the good of people will stress effective freedom. Moreover, aspects of autonomy, obscure though that notion is, must surely be part of what to want and what to have weighed on one's own behalf in social arrangements. Even if a person is mistaken on what to pursue in life, an important part of what to want for the case of being that person is scope to think through what's important and pursue what she concludes to be important. Concern for a person's good includes wanting her to have scope, even to make her own mistakes. Do the moral requirements of respect for persons go beyond what these broadly utilitarian considerations support? As I've characterized a person's good, it's hard to see how they could, at least so far as morality is a matter of living together on terms that no one could reasonably reject. A person's good just means the magnitude to reciprocate in terms of, whatever that is. If the things to heed out of respect aren't a matter of a person's good, then by this definition, they aren't things to enter at the basic level into fair reciprocity. My colleague Stephen Darwall offers a brilliant and illuminating alternative way of defining a person's good, a way that merits careful study. I'll sketch it quickly in my own terms as I understand it. So a person's good, Darwall says, is what to want, given and insofar as one is to care about the person. Care he treats as a characteristic human attitude, as a natural kind of the human psyche. Darwall thinks that one can raise even the question of whether to care about oneself. If the answer is yes, then by definition, one's own good is what to want out of the care to have for oneself. Darwall himself thinks that the morality of care is not all of morality, that there's also the morality of respect. What to want if and insofar as one is to respect oneself may thus be different from what to want insofar as one is to care about oneself. And the morality of respect may deal in things other than the good of people. Now, in a way, Darwall's concept of a person's good fits nicely into a Harshanyi-Rawls sort of original position. We can now specify that each party from behind the veil of ignorance is to care about herself exclusively. But if a person's good, as Darwall defines it, is not the only thing to reciprocate in terms of, then my own way of defining a person's good is not equivalent to Darwall's, since my own way makes such a divergence impossible. It's not to the good of people in my sense, it's to the good of people in my sense, not Darwall's, that the Harsanyi argument applies as drawing out the implications of fair reciprocity. It's my concept that requirements of coherence in thinking how to live with others drive us to. Well, none of what I've said, I should say finally, rules out coherent ultimate disagreement on what a person's good consists in. Well, how could it? Questions of how to live are not settled by requirements of formal coherence alone. There remain then further questions. Among people whose conclusions are coherent and humanistic in form, but who still disagree, how can they live together on a basis of mutual respect? And what if their conclusions aren't even humanistic in form? Of course, we have to ask, what if people aren't even coherent in their evaluations of the evidence and their resulting views on how to live? We face questions of what kind of imperfect political consensus to promote for the world as it is, and as we might help to make it. On the need to address these questions, utilitarians and non-utilitarians will agree. So questions of justice and of right or wrong, I started out by saying, are questions of how to live with others and how to feel about one's own actions and the actions of others. I've been tracing a path for our planning how to live with each other to take a path from Scanlon to Harsanyi. I hope that I've conveyed a little of what recommends the path. Anti-utilitarian intuitions are easy to elicit, but even our strong intuitions are incoherent. Any coherent view on how to live will run into strong contrary intuitions at some point. Harsanyi's theorems don't rule out all opposing moral views as incoherent, but they do indicate a kind of incoherence that attempts to, at a close match to moral intuitions, we'll run into. If an intuitive moral restriction isn't one that we would have chosen for the sake of humanity, we need to ask, why lend credence to it? If our thinking how to live with others takes the form I've been advocating, then our answers won't fall prey to this objection. Thank you.
We're again going to take a very short break, just a couple of minutes, and then we'll resume with comments from Francis Kamm and John Broome. Okay, I think we should resume. As I said, we have two commentators today. The first commentator is Professor Francis Kamm. Professor Kamm is the Littauer Professor of Philosophy and Public Policy at Harvard University, where she's on the faculty of the Kennedy School of Government and the Department of Philosophy. Prior to moving to Harvard in 2003, she taught for many years at NYU, where her primary appointment was in the philosophy department, and she also held appointments in the schools of medicine and law. Professor Kamm is one of the leading moral philosophers of our day. Her extensive and ingenious writings address central theoretical questions in ethics as well as important issues of practical concern. She's the author of Creation and Abortion and a monumental two-volume work, Morality, Mortality. She's received numerous fellowships and awards and sits on various editorial boards. It's an honor to have Professor Kamm with us for these events.
Keep my watch here. I just hope time doesn't go faster on the West Coast, does it? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. So, but I've got to get this down so I can see I'll hold it here, okay. First of all, let me thank the department, or whoever it was who invited me, and the Tanner Committee, and it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be with my great colleagues. Alan Gibbard warns us that we must be prepared for conflicts between our intuitive judgments about cases and what on reflection we consider reasonable. The judgment of what is reasonable will also involve intuitive judgments, he thinks, though not about cases necessarily. I suspect I have been asked to comment, though I'm not a professor of metaethics, because I rely so heavily in my own work on intuitive judgments about cases. At one point, Gibbard describes what might be thought to be the method of those like myself. Try to get a consistent set of intuitive judgments and just go with that as the correct morality. But I think this leaves out at least the need to explain what intuitions that seem to be in conflict or inconsistent are, and whether they really are in conflict and inconsistent. And also to find out what deeper principles underlie the case-based intuitions and judgments that we have. For I do think that the plausibility of the principles, such underlying principles, is necessary to justify ultimately our intuitive judgments. I should also note that Thomas Scanlon's version of contractualism, to which Alan Gibbard refers, very much aims to explain and justify just the sort of case-based intuitions that Gibbard thinks actually conflict amongst themselves and with contractualism. Now, with that as an introduction, let me ask some questions. I have some more questions I hope I will be able to get to on Friday, but I'll try to do what I can today. Sorry, Thursday. Don't want to confuse you. Gibbard says that morality is for persons. It consists of humanistic preferences, which are preferences for the good of people. The minimal sense of this, he says, is that if a state of affairs is better for someone and no worse for anyone, then it is simply morally better. This is what he calls the prospective Pareto condition. A more robust interpretation is that morality seeks the maximal good for people, which is the maximal sum of individual utilities and thus the maximal expected utility for each individual behind a veil of ignorance. I think there are reasons to doubt, first, that morality is only for persons or sentient beings, and that the parts of it that are for persons take the form of arrangements that produce highest expected utility for individuals. Scanlon himself claims that there is a part of morality that is concerned with impersonal values. For example, it would be morally wrong to pave over the Grand Canyon or destroy great works of art, even if this was not bad for people. Admittedly, Scanlon thinks that there will be, in his system, contractualist system, only indirect ways to give weight to those values, but nevertheless, they are part of morality overall. Shelley Kagan and Larry Temkin have argued that the Pareto condition is just wrong. It can be morally worse if someone gets what is good for him, even if his getting it is not worse for anyone else. Consider an evil person who has utility 20 and a good person who has utility 10. It could simply be morally better if people have only as much good as they deserve in absolute terms, and also better if their relative utility is in proportion to their desert. If this is so, it could be morally worse if the evil person is better off than the good person, even if his being so does not worsen the condition of the good person in any way. It would be better if his utility were less than the good person's, at least if this is not below the point of his absolute desert, even though this loss of utility to him does not improve the condition of the better off person at all. Some proponents of equality as an impersonal value have also argued that it could be morally worse if some are better off, even if this does not make anyone else worse off. They call for producing equality even by leveling down, when this is the only way to achieve equality. That is to say, making some worse off, even though this improves no one else, because it results in equality. I actually think this view, to be plausible, must be connected to the desert view that I described previously. A final example emphasizes the possibility that morality is not always about what is good for people, but rather about expressing or representing the good of people, or their worth, as it is sometimes called. So suppose it was true that beings have a higher status, if it is true of them that they have some sort of special authority over themselves and may not be used without their consent when it is seriously against their interests at the time that they would be used. Even if they would be used to help many others, each of whom would be as badly off if not helped as those who would be used would be if they were used. For example, the standard illustration is, if we may not kill one person to stop 10 others from being killed. Now, some may interpret having this higher status as itself a good for a being that has it, even if it reduces the chances of his survival overall. I think it may just be good that there are beings with a higher status without it necessarily being good for anyone. And I mean this in a morally serious sense of good. Now, let me move on from this question of whether the conditions of Pareto are absolutely required. And let me raise some questions about the view that morality, being for people, involves its giving each individual his highest expected utility, and that this is what each would agree to behind a veil of ignorance when deciding for his own good. I will reflect on Gibbard's case involving the two parents with endangered children in considering these matters. Gibbard ultimately presents the parents' case, as I'll call it, by focusing on the potential loss to each of the two parents as what is at stake here. A and B are their names. And he says it is worse for parents to lose two children rather than one. He ultimately imagines the case, I believe I understand it correctly, though I might be a subject to error here. He ultimately imagines the case so that parent A has one child at home. I mean, he says, I think parent A has two children on page 3, but there's one who's in a canoe in danger. Parent B's only two children need saving in another endangered canoe, but only A can be a savior, has the power to affect the situation. Given this scenario, one possible state of the world would involve A saving his own endangered child, his one endangered child, thus winding up with two children, and B winding up with no children, having lost two. Another possible state of the world would involve A saving B's children, in which case A winds up with one child and B with two. The second state of the world involves higher overall utility and also higher expected utility for each parent behind a veil of ignorance. But it also involves the worst off parent being better off than the worst off parent in the alternative state of the world. As in that state, one parent winds up with no children, whereas in the state where A saves B's two children, as I've got it right, A still has another child somewhere else. This leaves it open that it is the desire to pick an arrangement in which the worst off person is as well off as he can be, rather than the desire to maximize ex ante expected utility that would or that could underlie an agreement or an arrangement that results in parent A having to save B's children. Now, move on to another case. Suppose that parent B has 4 children, 2 of whom are in endangered canoe. The others are okay. Parent A has 1 child, and that child is in another endangered canoe. In one possible state of the world, B winds up with 4 children and A with none when A saves B's 2 children. In another state of the world, B winds up with 2 children and A with 1 child because A saves his own child, 2 of B's die, and B has 2 at home. Ex ante expected utility of each parent is highest if there is an agreement to bring about the first possible state of the world, as there will then be 4 live children, and we are supposing that A and B have an equal chance, one has an equal chance of being parent A or parent B. But the worst off parent is better off in the second possible state of the world, for then he has 1 child instead of none. Suppose that all that were relevant is how things go for A and B. Then it seems to me that behind a veil of ignorance, it is a state with lower expected ex ante utility, in which the worst off position that anybody finds himself is better off. Is the better off position, namely, then has one child rather than none. And I think that this would be preferable if we take seriously the good of each person as a separate person. We should be concerned with the eventual good of each person, not just their expected utility behind the veil of ignorance. Of course, the sort of maximin reasoning, as it's called, that I've just been employing now, getting the state of the worse off parent as high as possible, could still result in the requirement that B, the person who has 4 children, if he was the only possible person who could save anybody, should save A's 1 child rather than his own 2 children in the endangered canoe, given that B has 2 children at home. Okay. This is one reason I do not think that the maximin solution is ultimately correct either. But what do I know? I've only got my intuitions. Anyway, next, suppose that parent A had only 1 child, and she is in the endangered canoe, and parent B has only 1 child, who is in another canoe going down, along with an orphan. No sharks, but there's an orphan here. One possible state of the world would involve A saving his 1 child and B winding up with no children. Another possible state of the world, A winds up with no children because he saves B's 1 child. If we just focus on the parent's good, it might not seem to matter much which scenario is chosen behind the veil of ignorance. But of course, the loss to the children themselves should also matter. And given that they are the only ones who stand to lose their lives, it might be thought that this is what matters most. And of course, an agreement to save 2 children rather than 1 maximizes each child's ex ante expected utility without violating a concern for making the worst off position as good as it can be. These considerations suggest that A should save the 2 children and let his own child die. But these considerations also imply a lot more. They imply that A should kill his child if this would save the other 2 children. Similarly, all that supports the view that an agreement would be chosen that results in an agreement would be chosen that results in an arrangement that gives A requirement to let his child die to save B's 2 children would also seem to support the view that A should kill his child if it would help save B's 2 children. It is notoriously hard to see why the difference between killing and letting die should matter morally in a utilitarian system. And considerations that support the view that B should abandon his 2 children when he has the power to do the saving in order to save A's only child, given that B has 2 at home, would also imply that he should kill his 2 children in the canoe if this is necessary to save B's only child. For it is also hard to see why the distinction between killing and letting die should matter in a system concerned with maximizing the position of the worst off. Now, Gibbard, of course, offers a reason why none of these arrangements might be sustainable, namely the strains of commitment. This involves the idea that one cares more for one's own child than for engaging in fair, reciprocal relations with others in supporting an arrangement that is best for everybody. Before considering the idea of the strains of commitment and what work it can do, let us consider, however, another approach to explaining the unsustainability of the specific requirements that we have been considering. Some might argue that a utilitarian perspective does not, in fact, require A to either let die or kill his child to save B's children. And this is the case where, B has only 2 children, the original case that Alan Gibbard began with. This is because a parent who could do this, someone might say, could not also have the sort of strong love for his child that in most other circumstances and overall makes for better lives for parents and their children. So those who contract for the sake of humanistic concerns and maximal utility would want the stronger form of love to exist and not the requirement to abandon or kill one's child with which that stronger love might be incompatible. Those who emphasize impersonal values might put this differently by saying that they might simply think that a greater value, the possibility of this super strong love entering the world, could be worth even overall losses of life and well-being by comparison to a world in which only the shallower form of love exists that permits for a parent to do that killing or letting die. But notice that such a either more intrinsically valuable type of love or even a super strong love that on the whole maximizes utility would also lead to strains of commitment in the following sort of case. And this is where I consider what work strains of commitment can do. A's child is drowning. The only way to save her is for A to kill B's child or children. A might suffer strains of commitment with respect to a rule that prohibits this sort of killing. Yet this does not in any way diminish our sense, and here I'm just talking about our intuitive sense, that A is morally required not to kill B's child or children. Just watch its own, sadly, child die. That has to be the fate. The fact that strains of commitment do not undermine the existence of a requirement in this case, or lead us to think, suggests that it is the content of the supposed requirement that A let his child die in order to save B's children, in Alan Gibbard's case. It's the content that makes this not actually be a requirement, rather than that there is such a requirement, rather than that there is no such requirement due to strains of commitment or due to the intrinsic or consequential good of having super strong love, crazy glue love, we might call it. There is another reason why I think strains of commitment do not account for why there is no requirement on A to save B's children and let his own die. It is always possible to coerce people into carrying out their duties, and this might maximize utility. For example, suppose A knew that it would be legally permitted and required for the state to put his daughter to death if he failed to let her die and save B's 2 children. Then there would be no good reason for him not to carry out his supposed duty and save B's children. The killing of a child who was impermissibly saved, as horrible as you think that might be, could be a system that deters other parents from avoiding their utilitarian duties and so be justified overall on utilitarian grounds. So what I want to emphasize here is that I haven't given any positive prescriptions or a positive account to justify various sorts of requirements, though I have suggested how impersonal values might play a role. I've tried to focus on some questions I have about the arguments for expected utility rather than, for example, maxi-min, and I've tried to raise some questions about the reasons that people give for thinking that we do not have certain sorts of requirements that I find inadequate as reasons for why they don't exist. Thank you.
Our next commentator is Professor John Broome. Since 2000, Professor Broome has been the White's Professor of Moral Philosophy in the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Corpus Christi College, Oxford. Prior to that, he had held academic posts at the universities of St. Andrews, Bristol, and London. He is, by training, both an economist and a philosopher, and in his research, he has used the insights of each discipline to help illuminate the other, to the very great benefit of both. He's also a leading contemporary theorist of normativity and the author of 5 important books: The Microeconomics of Capitalism, Weighing Goods, Counting the Cost of Global Warming, Ethics Out of Economics, and most recently, Weighing Lives. Professor Broome is a Fellow of the British Academy and also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. We're delighted to have him with us this week, and please join me in welcoming Professor Broome.
An amateur technician for a minute.
Well, thank you, Sam, for those kind remarks, and thanks to all of you for this invitation to come and speak here. It was a great honor. I like this lecture a lot, and I found myself agreeing with Alan on a great many points. I'm going to use this opportunity of commenting today to follow up just one of his more important points. In fact, what I'm going to do is add some extra support to it, add a different argument for one of Alan's claims, namely that Harshanyi is wrong to think that we should try and build a notion of goodness out of individual preferences, and instead that we have to concentrate on the good of individuals. I'm going to add an argument in support of that, but I'm also going to suggest that Alan slightly misled us at a couple of places along the path from Scanlon to Harshanyi, which he took us along. So I'm broadly in support, though I've got a couple of disagreements on the way. It's fortunate that I'm broadly in support because, as you can see, I needed Alan to put these what came as transparencies onto the screen here, and I hope that I'm now going to be able to use the technology following his lead. As Alan said, Harshanyi produced two theorems, both intended to give support to utilitarianism. The first was about the choices that a person would make if she was placed in behind a veil of ignorance in an original position and was asked to make choices between alternative social arrangements. The second theorem is very different, and that's the one that I've got written up here, and this is the one that I'm going to concentrate on. This theorem has nothing to do with an original position or a veil of ignorance. It's not in the contractarian tradition at all. It certainly has nothing to do with putting oneself in somebody else's shoes in evaluating how well their life is going. The first theorem that Alan mentioned certainly does involve that, putting oneself in someone else's shoes, but this one doesn't. And insofar as this gives any support to utilitarianism, it's support that doesn't come from the direction of contractarianism. The basis of it is different. In fact, we could say its basis is an intuitive one. What this theorem does is offer some assumptions at the beginning, which are supposed to come from intuition, and then by inference it derives a conclusion from them. What does it mean? I've got it written up there. Let me go through it, read through it. It's got some assumptions, first of all, and the first one is that each person has preferences that are coherent. Alan used that term, and what it means is that they conform to the axioms of expected utility theory. The second assumption is that social preferences are coherent. That's to say, they too conform to those same axioms. Now, we're obviously going to have to worry, if we want to interpret this theorem in detail, what Harshanyi means by social preferences. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that. I'm not going to. I'm just going to do the same as Alan does on this and take social preferences to mean simply, as he puts it, ethical betterness. Say one thing is socially preferred to another, I'm going to take to mean simply that it's ethically better than the other. And the third assumption is that these social preferences satisfy the Pareto condition, which Alan mentioned, and I spelled out in a bit more detail there. They say it contains two clauses. First, if everybody's indifferent between two prospects, then the social preferences are indifferent. And the second clause is that if one person prefers the first of two prospects to the second and no person prefers the second to the first, then socially social preferences prefer the first to the second. So those are the assumptions of the theorem. The conclusion I've got written down there, and I'm just going to read it out because the interpretation is debatable. The conclusion is that social preferences can be represented by an expectational utility function that's a sum of expectational utility functions that represent the preferences of the people. Now that's hard to understand and hard to interpret, and actually I'm not going to spend time on that because for a reason you'll see in a moment, we don't need to worry about the conclusion. There's going to be a reason to ignore the conclusion, as you might say. But the only thing I'll say about it is that it looks sort of utilitarian. And that's what Harsanyi was hoping to get out of it, that there was some sort of a utilitarian conclusion would emerge. That third condition there, the condition that social preferences satisfy the Pareto condition, that's where Harsanyi formalizes the idea that ethical betterness, goodness we might say, is to be founded on the preferences of the individuals. That condition says overall goodness depends on people's preferences, and that's something that Alan is opposed to, and it's something that I'm opposed to too, but my reason is different from Alan's. You'll remember Alan's argument against it. His principal argument was one that involves talking about Ida and J and their preferences behind a veil of ignorance for being in each other's position. But remember, preferences of that sort for being in the other person's shoes play no part in this theorem at all. They do in Harsanyi's other theorem, but they don't in this one. So those sort of considerations are not going to be applicable to this theorem, and I'm going to offer a different sort of consideration that is applicable. It arises from a different theorem, which I hope I can produce. Yes. Here's another theorem. The three assumptions on that theorem are exactly the same as the three assumptions of Harsanyi's theorem that I just stated. I just copied them out. They're the same three assumptions. The conclusion is that everybody agrees about the probability of every event. And that's a falsehood. It's not true that everybody agrees about the probability of every event. For example, some people think that the world is going to warm by about 4 degrees. It's likely, it's probable that the world will warm by about 4 degrees in the next century, and other people think that's not likely at all. And some people think people attach different probabilities to the Democrats winning the next presidential election. People assign very often assign different probabilities to the same event. People do not agree about the probabilities of all events. And moreover, that doesn't mean that any of them are necessarily irrational. There are certainly some circumstances in which we might expect that rational people would agree about the probabilities of events. For example, playing roulette in the casino, the roulette table is set up as a machine for delivering particular events with what might be called objective probabilities. And perhaps all rational people ought to agree on those objective probabilities. So at the roulette table, maybe we can expect that all rational people would agree about probabilities. But in life, away from the roulette table, that isn't so. The sort of events that we come up against in life are ones where rational people might very readily assign different probabilities to them. And that means that Harsanyi's theorem simply doesn't apply to life, because the three assumptions of the theorem imply a conclusion that in life is false. It's not true that everybody agrees about the probability of every event, even if we assume that everyone was rational. That would not be true. So one of Harsanyi's assumptions, in his theorem, must actually be a false assumption. Harsanyi was implicitly thinking of life as like a roulette wheel. He assumed that all probabilities are objective and agreed by everyone. But they aren't. So we can't learn anything about life from Harsanyi's theorem, that second theorem of his, as it stands. There's one point in Alan's lecture where he threatened us with Harsanyi's theorem if we were not sufficiently utilitarian, because if we were not, he pointed out, we would violate one of the assumptions of the theorem. But it's true, we will, if we're not sufficiently utilitarian, violate it. But that's not a threat, because we can't help violating it. One of those assumptions just has to be false. And given that this theorem depends on assumptions and one of them has to be false, that means we just can't learn anything about life from that theorem as it is. Now, I was going to try and explain to you the basis of this theorem, but I think I won't try and give you a general explanation of why this theorem applies. Instead, what I'll do is go straight to a discussion of one of Alan's examples, which illustrates the theorem. It's not going to provide a proof of it, but it's going to give you an illustration of why, when people disagree about probabilities, things go wrong and things don't happen in the sorts of ways that Alan's at one point was implicitly assuming. So I'm going to use Alan's father's example, the final version of Alan's father's example, just to illustrate the difficulties that arise when people have different assessments of probabilities. So here is the example, formulated in a table that's slightly different from Alan's. The example is his final version, as I said, when there are two fathers, each with two children, and either of two things might happen. It might happen that Father A finds himself on the shore with Father B's two children in the nearest canoe and one of his own children in the further canoe. Or it might happen that Father B finds himself on shore with two of Father A's children in the nearest canoe and one in the furthest canoe. And the question at issue is, what rule, what policy would the fathers, should they adopt in determining which of the children to save? So there are two policies here, the policy of saving your own and the policy of saving the most. Now, Alan assumed, in his formulation of it, that there are objective probabilities of a half each for these two events to happen. So there's a probability of a half that Father A might find himself on the shore, probability of a half that Father B might. And he points out that if the fathers only care about the number of their own children who will be saved, and they agree that the probabilities are each a half, then both of them will prefer this policy of saving the most, because if they pick the one of saving your own, then each father will either look just at A. Father A, in the policy of saving your own, will either have two children or no children surviving. Under the policy of saving the most, Father A will either have one child or two children surviving. And having either two or one is better than having either two or zero, so both would favour the policy of saving the most, which is the utilitarian solution. Now, this is obviously a highly contrived example, but it's more highly contrived if you assume that what determines which of the two states will take place, that the two events will take place, is something like a roulette wheel, a coin toss, with an objective probability of a half. If this was an example from life, there wouldn't be any objective probability of which position these people are going to be in. And it's quite possible that they would assign different probabilities to the different events. So let's suppose that happens. And let's suppose that Father A actually thinks what's likely to happen is that it's going to be he who finds himself on the shore and in a position with two of Father B's children near him and his own further away. So he thinks that this possibility, A being on shore, is the likely one, and this one, B being on shore, is the unlikely one. Now, and suppose he thinks that's much more likely. then he's going to prefer the policy of saving your own. Because in the thing that he thinks is likely to happen, he ends up with 2 children saved, whereas in the case which he thinks is likely to happen under this policy of saving the most, he ends up with only 1 child saved. So if he thinks that it's likely that he's going to be on shore, then he's going to favour the policy of saving your own. And if, on the other hand, Father B has the opposite judgment about probability and thinks he's likely to be on shore, then he's going to favour the policy of saving their own too. So both fathers in this case will prefer the policy of saving your own. Now that means that if they were to agree, to get together to agree what would happen, they would agree on the policy of saving your own, which is not the utilitarian policy in this case. That's the one that only saves 2 children as opposed to saving 3 children. So we cannot assume even that when the decision is made by agreement between the fathers that we will end up with the utilitarian solution as Alan assumed when people make different judgments about probabilities. But that was beside the point, because it's not contractarianism that I'm talking about. I'm talking about Harsanyi's other theorem, the one that has no contractarian basis. What conclusion can we draw from this? Well, the Pareto condition, which is implicit in the theorem, says that save your own is the better policy, because that's the policy that both fathers prefer. And that's a very hard thing to believe in this case, that save your own is a better policy, because the effect of that is that 2 children survive as opposed to 3 under the policy of saving the most. And in fact, I could explain that it would actually be against the coherence of the betterness relation or the social preference relation to accept the conclusion that the policy of saving your own is the best. So that illustrates how the Pareto condition gets into conflict with the coherence condition. Coherence in this case would be in favour of saving the most. The Pareto condition would be in favour of saving your own. The 2 things are in conflict, and that illustrates why the theorem fails. Now, I think that tells us that we have to give up the Pareto condition. The Pareto condition takes us wrong in a case like this because it takes us towards a policy of saving your own. It has to go. So what can we do instead? What can we put in its place? Well, I think what we need to do is just what Alan says. Give up the idea that overall goodness is going to be determined by the preferences of individuals, because in examples like that, that gets us the wrong conclusion. The preferences of individuals take us wrong in a case like this. Instead, we have to recognize that overall goodness has got to be founded on the good of the individuals, not on the preferences of the individuals. And we can actually simply reinterpret Harsanyi's theorem in those terms. Stop talking about preferences, start talking about goodness instead, and we end up with this, which is a reinterpreted version of Harsanyi's theorem. I just crossed out preference and put in good instead. We now have 3 new assumptions: that each person's good is coherent, that general good is coherent, nothing to do with preferences now, but good. By general good, I mean overall goodness. That we would take them to be equivalent to social preference, but I've now made that explicit. But I'm now not talking about individual preferences, I'm talking about individual goodness. I'm assuming that the structure of each person's goodness conforms to expected utility theory. That's what the first assumption says. Then I assume what corresponds in this reinterpretation to the Pareto principle, namely that good satisfies what I call the principle of personal good, but it's the same as the Pareto principle, just reinterpreted instead of good, in terms of good rather than in terms of preferences. And we can now simply apply the same mathematics and get the corresponding conclusion. The same theorem will give us what's written down there as the conclusion. I'll read it out. General good can be represented by an expectational utility function that's a sum of expectational utility functions that represent the good of the people. Now, that conclusion is actually one we should pay attention to, because that one can be derived from assumptions that are not necessarily false, or not inevitably false, as Hashani's own theorem was. This one is a conclusion we need to pay attention to, but unfortunately there isn't time to do that. But let me say once again, I think you can see that it sort of looks utilitarian. It's not utilitarian. It certainly is quite a lot weaker than what utilitarianism actually says, but it may give some sort of support to utilitarianism. And it avoids the difficulty that I described to you that Hashani's theorem encounters. Because the problem of Hashani's theorem was one to do with disagreement amongst probabilities, and that doesn't arise in this case. Why doesn't it arise? It's because when you assess another person's good, you're going to have to do it on the basis of your own probabilities, not her probabilities. Her probabilities determine her preferences, but your judgment about what's good for her has got to depend on your probabilities, not hers. So, for example, suppose you see somebody heading into a dangerous situation, or what you think is a dangerous situation. You will judge that that's bad for her on the basis of your judgment that she's standing into danger. And even if her probabilities are quite different and she thinks whatever she's doing is perfectly safe, that won't stop you from judging that she's doing something that's bad for her. She, no doubt, prefers to do it on the basis of her probabilities, but your judgments of good for her will depend on yours. So that means that when you are stating this theorem, when I'm stating this theorem, the good that I'm talking about is assessed in terms of my own probabilities, and those will remain the same all the way through the statement of the theorem. There will be consistent probabilities when the theorem is stated in my voice, and there will be consistent probabilities when it's stated in your voice too, so there won't be the problem that arises. So I think this gives a different argument, different from Alan's, but for the same conclusion as Alan's. Hashani's second theorem, when you look at it carefully, can only be understood properly if we change our attention away from people's preferences and concentrate on the good of people. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's a great privilege to have commentaries by two such marvelous philosophers, and clearly I'll have to do a lot of thinking between now and tomorrow. But let me say a few things about each of these wonderful commentaries. The position I took on intuitions, of course, is quite ambivalent. I was saying that on my kind of view, we're dependent on intuitions also. And so the question is going to be how sort of case-based are the intuitions? What rationale will we be able to discover for them? Are we do things come out when we try to make them coherent the way Sidgwick thought they did with some very broad intuitions, or that are whose connection to everyday moral thinking is quite indirect, or do we get intuitions that are much more closely connected with everyday intuitions? I was urging that we understand intuitions as bearing on this planning question of how to live with others, assuming that we should live with others on that an important goal is to live with others on a basis of mutual respect, but that doesn't in itself rule out intuitionism in a style quite different from Sidgwick. Now, let me just make a few broad comments about the way systematic considerations bear on intuitions. If we're, in the case of equality, I see lots of reasons to want equality, the kinds of social relations it makes possible, the dangers of dominance from when people are unequal, and certainly I think that we have a Jonathan Haidt sort of emotional intuition about equality. These come with intuitions about hierarchy as well. So Alan Fiske thinks that universally people organize social relations in 4 different ways, and those include market, probably 4th in primitive conditions, communally, hierarchically, and egalitarian. And so I think there are strong emotional intuitions attached to both equality and hierarchy. But in the case of equality, there's a question of why to want it, and why to want it. One reason to want it is that for non-moral reasons, that's what we'd want. That would be the thing to want for oneself in conditions where I didn't know whether I was going to be on top or on the bottom, and that leads to the usual utilitarian style arguments for equality. If we're talking about a greater equality than we would want for non-moral reasons, not knowing who we would benefit by, and if those are the wants to have for ourselves in those circumstances, that I'm puzzled about why to want that much equality. I'm also quite drawn to expressing things in our actions, but that leaves a puzzle. Why am I expressing one thing when I kill someone and expressing something different when I fail to save someone when I could? Is this a kind of expression that values crocodile tears, which are very expressive but don't very much bear on action? Seems to be, again, one question to ask is, well, suppose we ask the question what to prefer for a social order, not knowing in particular how we and those dear to us are going to be affected. It seems to me there are lots of reasons to want strong prohibitions on killing, and lots of reasons to be worried about equally strong prohibitions on failing to rescue. Duties not to kill are more focused. They establish a bright line. So do we really think that these prohibitions on this greater stress on not killing than on rescuing is something that that has nothing to do with what to want for non-moral reasons prospectively? It seemed to me that there are strong reasons to want such a distinction prospectively, and that's the place to look for a view that reconciles our intuitions about how to want to live with other people in society. Let me leave other things for tomorrow from this marvelous commentary. As John said, there are large areas of agreement, but that but he says I misled people, and I guess I did. I talked about theorems, and there are two ways of thinking about theorems in applied mathematics. One is as interpreted theorems. Now, I talked about the Pareto condition. Pareto was, as I understand it, adamant on using preferences and finding ordinal notions. That's not entering into my treatment, so I was thinking about the formal structure of the Pareto condition, and we both agree that the formal structure can be given an interpretation in terms of preferences and in terms of a person's good, and we both agree that the interpretation in terms of a person's good is the one that's morally relevant. Now the second Harsanyi theorem, John says, has nothing to do with putting oneself in each other's shoes. He says it has nothing to do with contractarianism, and I think I was using it as a different kind of argument from the contractarian one, but we both agree, Francis doesn't, that it's an argument with a great deal of force, but it has something to do with putting oneself in other people's shoes on some interpretations and not on other interpretations. John, at least here, is helping himself to the notion of a person's good. I've been worried about Scanlon's critique, and so trying not to help myself to the notion of a person's good. Also, I want the notion of a person's good to come out of realizing that that moral thinking is thinking how to live with each other and why, and so I want the concept of a person's good to come out of such thought, so we can evaluate a state by the prospective good of the people involved, interpreting the prospective good in terms of doing the thought experiment of, as Hare would put it, knowing that one is forthwith to be that person, and then thinking what to want counted for purposes of reciprocity. Under that interpretation, the theorem does have something to do with putting oneself in other people's shoes. Okay, so we end up in the same way. I try to get there by reinterpreting Harsanyi's by changing from Harsanyi's interpretation of the Harsanyi theorems in the Pareto tradition. I think at one point I slipped back into talking about preferences, but that was a mistake. We both agree that it requires this reinterpretation. I'm suggesting that we can understand the reinterpretation in terms of thought experiments of supposing that one's to be the person in question. Thank you.
We're just about out of time, so I think that rather than try to squeeze in a question or so today, I think we'll just ask you to hold your questions for tomorrow. Tomorrow's format will be that there will be additional comments made by each of the three commentators, and then there'll be discussion amongst the panel, and there'll be ample opportunity for people to ask questions from the audience as well. So please come back tomorrow at same time, 4 o'clock, 4:10, for the third and final installment of this Tanner series. Thank you very much.